Hi, welcome everyone. This is Aspen Family Business Group, our webinar for October on estate planning. Happy to have you here. I'm Shelley Taylor, the Executive Director of our recently formed nonprofit, Aspen Family Business Group. And today, presenting on estate planning are Natalie McVeigh and Leslie Dashew. And happy to have all of you joining us. If it's your first time, welcome. If you've been here before, welcome back. And we do have the Q&A featured enabled in this webinar. We encourage you to ask questions. You could do so anonymously if you choose. And in the interest of time, we will get started. So I will hand it over to Natalie.
Hi, everyone. Leslie and I are going to chat a little bit about estate planning. If you've ever read our bios, you'll notice we're not estate attorneys. I do have some trusts and estates background and have even taught at a trust school. This is not meant to be traditional legal advice. It's meant to talk about, the dynamics that we discuss in estate planning, which impacts all of us. So it'd be great, as you know, the Q&A is anonymous, but if anyone thinks they're done with estate planning, you want to just jot that down so we know who's in the audience, how far you are. If you want, you can also tell us when you last look at your estate plan if you have one.
I think an important question is, why do we want to talk about this topic? And as Natalie mentioned, we both work with families who are in business together and families of wealth. And one of the biggest challenges that I found is that people don't want to talk about either death or money. Those are two of the three taboo subjects, sex, of course, being the third. But when we talk about estate planning, we're dealing with both death and money. And so there's oftentimes an innate resistance to doing this work. Yet, if we don't do this planning, we're risking the loss of assets to the taxman. We're leaving issues for heirs to resolve among themselves and really contributing to the risk of greed, entitlement, and jealousy conquering the assets. Natalie, what are some examples you've experienced when you think about some of these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, there've been a lot of challenges that clients have, and I think there's twofold. Everything you said, which is the risk planning challenge issue, and I think there's that complexity when if you're a family that owns a business or a family that has some wealth, the idea is that you're too sophisticated to not know the answer. And so
Mm.
what I see a lot of my clients do is they go into their estate attorney or sometimes their business attorney and they say, make the document like my father or my friend at the club. And the challenge is most of us didn't go to law school. And so then we've put something in that we don't understand. And so the risk there with lots of legal documents, if I put on my mediator hat, from having mediated a lot of these family conflicts, is you probably have a trust that exists already. And you probably have a trustee that doesn't know what that means, especially if it's a family member. You probably have a bylaw or a shareholder agreement or both. And if they weren't written by the same people at the same time, they may be in conflict with one another. And more than that, because we're not attorneys, we try to synthesize this information to in a way that we understand. And so accidentally, and I promise you this, please don't be a family member who goes and hire an attorney tomorrow. I haven't yet seen a client that's accidentally doing something inconsistent with those legal documents because they don't quite understand them. And that becomes more problematic when we're more acrimonious than not.
So I was thinking about a client many, many years ago, probably 30 or 40 years ago, who was struggling with succession planning first in his family business. He had a chain of funeral homes and he had a son who he wanted to have as an heir. He did a great job of preparing this heir. And then turns out this young man had a serious drug problem. And so he ended up getting him into treatment and we found the right resources for him and he went into recovery. And then he started doing the estate planning with his attorney. And this was before the days when we had the large exemption that we have now. And so he had done the extensive estate planning. He had beautiful documents created. He hadn't yet signed them. There was something inside of him that was reluctant to sign. It's kind of like I'm signing something so final when I sign that document that a lot of people are reluctant to do that. But the sad thing was he went up in a private plane and may have had a heart attack, but in any case, the plane crashed and the estate plan was not in effect. And so the family ended up owing half of their estate to the tax to the federal government. And they had to sell the business in order to pay for that tax bill. And here he had done all the work except for the last piece. And so it's a reluctance to do that seems to have something to do with an innate fear of being final, or concern about demotivating our kids if they know what we're going to leave for them. And some of the people don't want to disappoint their kids, and so they don't want to have this discussion. So there are a lot of obstacles to doing this, but it's really important that it get done.
Absolutely, Leslie. The goal of doing and using these structures is that they preserve and help us, right? Estate planning, risk, heck, ambulance chasers, anything can really, depending, especially a lot of my clients have S corporations, and we'll probably do another webinar about different structures for your company and why they're helpful. But in many states, the law doesn't distinguish personally from an S corp so if I hit the car in front of me and an ambulance chaser Googles me, my business might be the thing they can also get assets from, not just Natalie McVeigh personally. And so your estate attorney, your business attorney, there's a team of professionals, and we have a slide in here about those. They're going to help mitigate that risk. And to Leslie's point, there's a reason why we want to be really careful when we do estate planning and do it well, because it can be final. It can be i- irreparable. And the challenge for people is if we don't think far enough ahead about what's possible, or if we're too restrictive, um, and if we're not working with the right people to help it work, it can have really challenging consequences for our families. And we don't apply the same lens when we think about a state that we do when we think about other things. So a lot of clients say, if I die versus when I die. And the conversation isn't if, it's when. And do we want to be planful for it, or do we want it to be a problematic event?
And I think about the problematic events, for example, when families are struggling at the death of somebody they love a lot and they're grieving, and then all of a sudden they're having to deal with assets. And what did mom or dad want to have happen with these assets? And then heirs have to resolve this among themselves if they haven't gotten clarity from their parents or understand what their parents were thinking, or other family members who are leaving. And this can contribute to greed, entitlement, and jealousy, the things that people worry most about in families, that our kids are going to be at each other. And that's something that actually families can prevent by being clear about what they want to have happen when they die. I had a client once who had 5 kids, and they were really worried about what would happen when dad died. And they brought me in because they thought he was going to die any day now, and they wanted to be sure the business was taken care of. But in actuality, what the issue was around the personal assets that they had. And so one of the things that we structured was mom took a handful of stickies and she gave them to the 5 kids. And she said, go around the house and put stickies with your name on it on the things that you really want the most. And then I will put together a list and have who wants what. And if there's some things that several of you want, then I'll figure out who gets which favorite thing and who doesn't. And then she felt great relief. And so did they, because then they knew this was settled, and it was settled in a way that felt like it was considerate of the kids and what they wanted. And it was also something that was a way for mom to know she could be fair and be responsive to what her kids wanted.
And I think that was really important. You talked about the greed, jealousy, and those kinds of things. But I also think there's all of the emotional dynamics we have with siblings, and that we have different versions of parents, right? One of the things you might have in an estate plan is a living power of attorney, not just a living will. And, one of the clients early in my career, one of the clients went in for, a pretty benign procedure, something akin to appendix surgery that, almost always people say, don't worry, but ended up getting sepsis and lived, was conscious, but on vents and things like that. And, it's 3 siblings, 3 daughters. They'd already had issues. They'd hired me because of that. They had many challenges. And the oldest daughter was the power of attorney. And when the 2 youngest went to get something to eat, who were sitting by the matriarch's side, the matriarch wrote on a tablet and said, pull the plug. Like, this is it for me. I don't want to be on these vents. Right. And so they did, right? This was the power of attorney child that no one really knew. No one had discussed. That adult child didn't even know at the time. I can tell you the damage that family that we had to do. We had to, stop the process. And this was just another time that this eldest daughter, who was maybe considered the favorite, maybe got all of mom's time and effort, was maybe going to be the successor, although ended up being so in such really challenging moments is exacerbated, right? You often find that the adult children during this grief, even though they might have been mad at the parent when things didn't go right, the moment that they're no longer there, they're all vying to do right by mom or dad in a world where they don't have any direction. And so all of those emotional dynamics now have this overlay of how do I do right by mom or dad? And now we can hold grudges between one another. And so, even though this tool is meant to reduce risk, when we think about these tools, whatever's in the estate plan, often the risk that your attorneys, who are very brilliant and very smart, are saying is it will avoid an emotional cost if we do it this way. And each one of your attorneys has their perfect way of doing it. And I genuinely mean it's perfect. They've studied this, they know it immensely. But unless we actually help them see what's going on in your family, that perfectly technical solution becomes technically challenging for those who have to live it. We can skip ahead a slide or two.
And I think the issue of communicating it not only to the kids, but if you have a business, a family business, communicating it to the key stakeholders in the business as well, so that they know what's on the mind of the founder or the leader of the business and what's the emergency plan if something happens to that person, not just a long-term plan. And a lot of times those plans aren't articulated and communicated to everyone who's involved.
Absolutely. You know, on this list here, just so you know, we're not speaking about the slides. You're going to get them. We wanted them to be pretty clear for a reference because these can be pretty tricky things. Is having the document doesn't solve everything. You know, one of the things my clients tend to say is, well, we'll do 50-50 ownership. Or we'll do co-trustees, whether it's mom and kids or two siblings together. That 50-50 means we have to agree. And all of you, even if you're not in a family business on this call, but you probably are from a family, right? You probably have someone else in your life. It is very hard for two people to agree on absolutely everything. And so this joint ownership or equal ownership or co-trustees actually says that if we can't agree, nothing happens. And that's the consequence of some of this planning that we don't spend enough time thinking about. And sometimes the only way the person who feels like they don't have the power or the attention gains that after is just the power to stop things, which is just to be contrarian to you sometimes. And that's really the key. You know, I had this client who created this magnificently complicated estate plan for four of his daughters, and he was giving one daughter significantly less. She was incredibly talented, had a job outside of the family company, wildly successful on her own, and she also had no children. Right. And I asked him, what was this about? He was giving her, I think, half of what he was giving everyone else. And he said, well, she just doesn't need it. Like, she's been wildly successful. Also, she doesn't have any kids. And I said, okay, so let's tell her. Let's talk to them about it. And he's like, no. And I was like, why? He's like, because they're going to fight. And I said, yeah, that's why you hired me. You didn't want to fight. And so now you know they're going to fight. And he's like, yes, but I won't be there to see it. And that's really the challenge. A lot of times, besides the fact that we're afraid to burden children and we're afraid to do other things, we do estate plans in secret and keep it quiet because we know something about it doesn't sit. I agree with Leslie. My guess is if she had had a little more time with that client, or maybe she'd had these conversations, and I have clients like that, where the beautiful estate plan isn't signed, the thing is there's an emotional reason as to why. We know this isn't working. And so in your estate planning, it's not a static document. I promise you, your smart attorneys can make anything you want to have happen technically. You just need to talk to them about it. And it's really actually saying, if I'm worried I have a spendthrift kid, I might not give them less. But how do I put the right securities and the right trustee in there who might be able to manage that spend, who might be able to work with them well to create that budget that's effective? And that's probably not someone in the family. And that's really what we want to talk about with this is estate planning can be dynamic. And you have to give your estate attorneys and other professionals a clear picture of what's going on there and that clear picture of what your fears are, but also what those desires are. We see too much fear-based planning rather than hopes and dreams planning, which can sometimes create the opposite effect of what we want. If we don't give our adult children enough rope to create competencies and create capacities, we often engender more misbehavior. And so interestingly, that tightrope that we give afraid of fear actually creates more. because you don't learn those competencies and capacities.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to begin with, that we need to tell our advisors what it is we want. We don't have to have all the solutions about the how. A lot of times I have clients who say, well, I haven't figured out how to do this yet. But if you can articulate what the outcome is you want, that I want to have my kids have a certain amount of latitude, but also some controls that limit the risk of their spending it all right away. That brings up the point, Natalie, about when do we have these conversations, and when do we begin to get part of our estate away? And a lot of families, as you have mentioned, don't want to do anything until after they're gone because they don't want to deal with the disappointment or the hurt or the conflict. But that also decreases the probability that the kids can learn from the parents. My dad was the old school who said, no, I don't want my kids to know what my assets are. And so when I was in this field a little while, I went to my dad and I said, why? And he blurted out, because it might make you guys demotivated to work hard. You might become lazy. And I laughed and I said, you've got one son who's a judge. You've got another son who's built a worldwide business. And I'm a consultant and I work harder than I need to work. I said, and you really think that if we found out you have X amount of dollars or property that we would stop working? And he laughed and he said, no, that's true. And so then he began to talk about what he owned and gave us the opportunity to learn about how do you manage real estate. And none of us who had been involved in that area really didn't know much about it. So it gave us the chance to learn from him. But one of the questions that oftentimes estate attorneys are struggling with advising, and families are saying, how do we know if they're mature enough to really begin to have control of some of these things? And in the olden days, Natalie, I remember people saying, well, we're going to give a third of the wealth at 30, a third at 40, and a third at 50 or something like that. So if they blow the first, they're going to blow the first third, and then the next third, they might be a better manager of it. And the last third they'll have when they're older. But that is not great criteria, just the age, because we're finding now that maturity is not defined by what decade you're in. But there were 4 advisors, 2 psychologists, and 2 attorneys. The attorneys were the Warners, who came up with what they call markers of adulthood that they felt would be really helpful in having families think about, are my kids mature enough to have the knowledge or have the wealth? And there were 5 areas that they talked about. One was financial self-sufficiency. These are people are mature if they have reached a benchmark that demonstrates they have the capacity to live within a budget and to be financially responsible. The second one is that they have a purpose, a sense of purpose, and they're pursuing something, a work, career, education, or self-advancement. And so if they're doing that kind of thing, then yes, they're showing that they're taking responsibility for their lives and they have something that's a drive for themselves. The third is they're reasonably free of problematic behaviors, which might include substance abuse or gambling or indulgent overspending or abusive or destructive relationships or cults, that kind of thing. Fourth is that they're involved socially and emotionally. We're all social beings, and our ability to form connections with others really is an important definition of our happiness. And so if you see that your offspring are involved emotionally and socially, then it tells you also that they are somewhat mature. And finally, the social emotional maturity is a definition of one's own functioning, matches how other people see me. And so an individual doesn't grossly overinflate or underinflate his capabilities or accomplishments. So these are 5 areas that, if parents are looking at if their heirs are responsible enough to be involved in making decisions or understanding what to do with the wealth. Again, purpose, competence, confidence, reciprocity of relationships, and understands or identify one's own gifts and talents. So those are another way of looking at these.
I agree with you, Leslie. The 3 tranches at different ages, and families vary on those ages. People are still using it.
Yeah.
I've been doing this for almost 20 years. I'm surprised people do. They change the ages, but we find that doesn't work as well. There's kind of 2 ways to do it. These 3 tranches, again, not the right way, but ways that there's this kind of common knowledge, right? And you have to decide whether that's true or not. There's actually, I think, a really great book called that. I think it's called Common Knowledge. This idea of what everyone else knows that isn't us. It's not related to family business in particular, but it is a really interesting phenomenon. But one of the things we see besides the 3 tranches is also the after our death thing. Challenge with the after our death thing, to Leslie's point earlier, is they don't get to learn from you. But even if your adult child decides to do something completely different from you, it stops their adult planning themselves. With the longevity revolution that we're having, when people are living longer than, 75. I mean, there's this great book called The 100-Year Life. They're saying that people already are born now, they're going to live 120 years. So imagine waiting to die. Let's just say 100. Let's not talk about 120. And you had kids right after college, so you're 22. You die at 100. Your kids aren't going to get anything till they're 80. Their kids, if they did the same thing, are 60, and so on and so forth. So if I am a family that's created wealth over time, and I get it, it's an inheritance, it is a gift, it is not necessarily something we're entitled to, but I'm trying to empower my adult children to be adults and make adult decisions for their children. If they're not getting some part of the money, which you might consider annual gifting or using your lifetime gifting now, you aren't empowering them either to be individuated, to make complete financial choices, which is a part of what the Warner's research says. Now, you could argue that they should have made enough during their lifetime. Maybe. I had this other client early in my career where he had, again, 4 daughters. I tend to work with a lot of clients that are matriarchs and have daughters. Many also have sons as well. One of the daughters was a social worker. She was tapping out. This was, again, 15 or 16 years ago, at $3K a year, working full time, working many hours. And he had another daughter that was a really great film producer, and in fact won an award very similar to Sundance, was making negative dollars, was borrowing from the trust she wasn't to get yet to create that film. And it was really something he would not do. He wouldn't use annual gifting, which is still, back then, was a small amount of money, and he wouldn't use lifetime gifting, because for him, the mark of success was how much financial capital they could make. And, one of the things we did when we worked with this client, besides putting their estate plan together and figuring things out, was change the frame. Because both of these women were contributing, doing as many hours as there's 2 other siblings who were in the public sector, making significant more amounts of money. And so that idea of, I don't want to tell them because I'm going to ruin them, I don't want to tell them because it'll break them, all of those things actually stop individuation as well. And you might say, well, a different family without wealth, they would bootstrap and they would figure it out themselves. But the goal of that family wealth, ideally and hopefully, is to allow the family to do what they're best at. That doesn't always show up monetarily. You would use a different skill if these young people weren't producing and spending a lot. That's a different question. And one of those things might be a financial skills trust, where we actually say, based on this, you get a higher distribution, you get these amount of access, and these other types of ways. And so I think that's the goal of this conversation today. And please do feel free to ask questions in the Q&A about things you've been wondering about. Because we're not saying don't do estate planning. We're emphatically saying do it. We're not saying don't use an estate attorney. We're emphatically saying do it. And we're saying that you're going to have to help those really smart professionals understand the full nuance of what's going on with your adult children or your parents, right? One of the things estate attorneys used to say, too, is that all stock needs to be out of people's hands at 65. Because, again, people were dying at 75, dementia was creeping in, Alzheimer's creeping in. There's now new language that speaks to competency, because the research does say that wisdom is a real thing. Brains over 55 are smarter. It takes them longer to get that information out, right? So do I want the majority shareholder to forfeit the shares right now when they might be the best decision maker? We can go forward on some slides. This is come back to the one just previously. Sorry about that. This is the key that I want to talk about. Again, putting on my mediator hat. You would not believe how many estate lawsuits happen about the asset that is not the asset we planned for. Your estate attorney is going to ask you to wrap up the business. Your estate attorney is going to ask you to wrap up tangible property of significant sums. And that's very important. I'm not saying don't do that. And I'm saying that a vast majority of the lawsuits that I've seen and have to mediate have to do with something emotional. right, have to do with the family cabin. And by that, I don't mean the compound in the Dominican Republic. I actually mean the tiny shack falling apart. Have to do with the artwork over the fireplace. And this is a really interesting example. I was working with this client, also lots of daughters. There are about 3 daughters, one of which was the biological daughter of the mother who'd suffered a terminal illness and had recently deceased. The other two were older stepchildren. And in this family in particular, the dad said, of course, my wife who recently died, the other mother had also died early on, I believe related to cirrhosis or something. The biological daughter, because they're all three were his biological daughters, but the one that's biologically related to the mother is clearly going to get the jewelry because it was her mother that died. And the interesting thing that we learned in this, the two other siblings were upset, not about the value, although it was a significant collection of jewelry in this large family estate, the numbers didn't matter. It was really that, this mother, in her own way, the stepmother, the mother they knew because their mother had died really young, the way that she got to know the girls was picking out the jewelry with them. She thought that these girls who were in their teens would like more. So they had these lovely experiences that her daughter didn't, right? Her daughter was like 0 to 10 when most of this jewelry was acquired. And it was their relationship with this woman. And so thankfully, in this case, the father was still alive and we were able to change how we did this. And so the thing the biological daughter asked is that she actually be the one to disperse the assets because she wanted to have those conversations with her sisters. And they actually, even though they got it all appraised, they put that to the side when they were making decisions. And interestingly enough, after all three of them shared it, it was plus or minus in the range of each other around exactly even. And in
Mm.
those plus or minus categories, they let it go. They weren't saying that I'll fix the asset later because they had this really healing experience. So what you see on Succession, what you see on TV is an estate will rip you apart. An estate not planned for the social emotional part of it, which is the biggest part, will rip the family apart.
Mhm.
One that's planned properly with that isn't. And what I can tell you about entrepreneurs is they're collectors of a bunch of stuff. I've seen clients with the largest Asian art collection, the largest, coolest car collection. I mean, just a bunch of stuff that may cost assets if you give it to a museum, that may do a lot of other things, but means something to the family, regardless of the dollars that it costs. And so this disbursement of assets, first, getting an entrepreneur who spent his or her entire life collecting it, mapping that down is real tough and making sure that it hasn't changed from the time it was mapped. But then two, creating a way that comes together where we make joint decisions together to effectively disperse it is hugely important, powerful, and in fact, healing. And it starts that relationship with adult children. Because while the parents are alive, we look at them like a lighthouse for direction of what needs to happen next. And so as that light's diminishing, we can build those skills together through this process.
One of the key things that keeps popping up as we have this conversation is that which is most important to us. What are our values and why? When parents are able to have that discussion with their kids, it really enhances the intimacy of that relationship. And sometimes they haven't been able to do that when they were younger, if they were busy, and now they can have that discussion. Like the person you mentioned who wrote a note saying, I don't want to deal with this. It's important for us to have discussions about in terms of our own mortality and what are our wishes about how we want to go and why, so that our kids understand that. And then, what do we value in terms of charitable giving? So often families are charitable, but then they're afraid to have that conversation because they think the kids will be upset about them giving to charity rather than to them. But the kids may actually have some of the same values, but they need to understand what the parents' values are and why. That they as kids are not less important, but that the parents have a way of thinking about how they want to contribute with their life's earnings to the community as well as to the family. And knowing that and having that conversation can help kids feel better about what happens when the time comes rather than be surprised.
Yeah, and the part two of that story about that father that wanted to give over half less to the one daughter who didn't have kids, I think he ended up giving her a third less. But when he talked to her about it, and that's what I mean when I say your kids are cooked. When we keep things from our adult children, and sometimes adult children do mean 21, but sometimes in this case they were like in their late 40s, and in this one particular woman's case, not in childbearing years. She heard what dad said. Like, dad wanted the same thing that she wanted, which is more for the grandkids, but she wanted to do it as an aunt.
Mhm.
So her plan was don't take more than one third, because I actually already intended on doing really great aunt trips with all my nieces and nephews. Really big bat mitzvahs, bar mitzvahs, sweet 16s, like whatever she wanted to do. And so what she wanted to do was to have that. They were actually closer, and that's when you were talking about the values just a second ago, Leslie. A lot of the fear-based planning that we do doesn't allow us to see our adult children close these gaps, right?
Mhm.
And so when we engage earlier in this dialogue, we actually get to see what they're made of. We allow them to surprise us in positive ways. And better than that, if it doesn't all work out peachy keen, because some of you might say that'll never happen in my family, is then we catch them when they're going to make that mistake. Because they're going to make that mistake whether I'm living or dead, unless I put the right structures in place, which I'm going to need to know about sooner rather than later to understand the type of issue arising.
Yep. Another experience like that I was thinking about was someone who had a beach house, and somebody else, my dad, had a boat, and other people, as you said, have cabins. And a lot of times kids enjoy these opportunities, but they don't know what the responsibility is and the cost to take care of them. And so part of that preparation is to say to the kids, I want you to be involved in helping to do the work for this. In the case of the beach house, I was thinking about all the kids participated in preparing the house for the summer and closing it up for the winter, learning what had to be done to maintain it, calling the plumbers if that needed to happen, so that they understood what the responsibilities were and how much it cost. And this was not an extraordinarily wealthy family. So when the parents started getting into their 80s, and they said, we don't want that responsibility anymore. And here, now you guys have seen what it takes. Do you want to keep it and be responsible for paying for it and be responsible for maintaining it? And the three daughters said, we don't really. We enjoy it, but we enjoyed it when you guys were taking the primary responsibility for it, and that it doesn't work in our lifestyles. And so as a family, they were able to make that decision together, which then was much easier way and more respectful, mutually respectful way of doing it. And I think that's part of the education that can happen as you plan for your estate and you factor in what the next generation may or may not want.
Absolutely. I've had clients that create pop-up trusts to get collections to museums that they don't want the effort of working on, but they want to make sure it stays together. There are options for not just endowments to universities, but that happen way later that the founder entrepreneur doesn't see, but you can do a virtual endowment where you pay a certain amount in your lifetime. And I think that's part of the qualitative dialogue of what would I like to achieve, by when, what's enough for my own lifestyle, which I think is the next slide that we talk about that group of professionals, because it isn't just the estate attorney. And a trust attorney, and sometimes they're not the same. Some attorneys that specialize in trusts are not your estate attorney, but you want to use them in conjunction. And I'm pretty much guessing that all of you already have trust, whether you know it or not. And we're going to spend a little bit of time at the end of this talking about trust, but we're going to have a bigger session on trust. Your business attorney, right? You don't want these documents contradicting each other, which I promise you happens more often than not. And watch your legal team's succession plan as well, because sometimes the person who takes over writes a different thing. You also want estate and trust accountants who help you understand what that future focus is going to be, what those numbers change and impact. A business accountant, and those again are usually complementary, and they should be talking to each other. And you're probably doing math in your head and being like, each one of these professionals is a high burn rate. They may be, which is why you want to get your ducks in a row with some questions first before you get there. And your financial planner, because when I know that my needs are taken care of and I can project out to the future, I can decide how much I can use now for my adult children and or grandchildren to achieve their dreams, right? And to do their planning. A lot of what had been a happy, not accident because it was planned, but a happy thing that a lot of my clients find out for is many of your adult children may not have to put retirement accounts together. Some may, but many of them don't have to put college funds together because you already have your parents already have 529 for them. And so what happens when we're not talking to all of these people, and we'll talk about the next two in a minute, and talking to them early and letting our adult children know, is you can be using duplicative resources for things. Now, a lot of my clients who did put in a retirement account found out happily later they don't need one, got to parlay that into starting their own business. But again, what choice are we not giving our adult children when we're not giving this information? And so having these professionals, you don't always want them all to sit in the same room together. You want somebody to quarterback some of that and have a plan, but they should be talking to each other to make sure we're doing these right. We're not having anything that's gone wrong. And even if your estate plan is done, I didn't see anyone drop in the Q&A that theirs is done, you want to look at it again at least every 5 years. And about every 10 years, you might want to tweak it, right? You'll see some people write in the will, who they had wanted to be the parent or guardian of their children in case they die, and the children are still in a minority age, but that person, he or she has already passed as well, right? Those things happen. A lot of our successor trustees or executors are our friends in our similar age group. And if I'm aging and I'm at risk of passing, so are likely the people named in those documents. And again, like I said, if they're created at different times, they can accidentally conflict with each other. And the other two people you want to really think about are an executor and a trustee. And Leslie and I are going to talk about this extensively, but we'll talk about our experience. In both of those cases, family members, although they can do it and they can be smart enough to do it, they can be trained really well to do it. You can go to a trust school or learn about how to be a really good executor, because you're family and because you're in pain when these two things are usually needed, and because we're all fighting over what mom or dad wanted to do or not do, it makes it insurmountably difficult for family members to be in that role, even if they're the smartest and best qualified, because of those few things. And there's actually a neurological thing where people who've grown up together or been married a long time literally can't hear each other. It's called closeness communication bias. It's like when your parents are bickering in the car and they're saying the exact same thing and you say it in a third way that you get heard. So I'm not saying it cannot be a family member in these roles, but as a trustee and an executor, as a family member, it's really tough. It's a heavy lift. Leslie, thoughts?
Yeah, I think the executor tends to be a more time-limited role, and that sometimes is more feasible in my experience. But the trustee goes on for years or decades and has a lot of ongoing power. And I've got one family right now where the way the trust was set up is the trustees, and there are two of them at this point, can choose their own successors, and the family doesn't trust the successors that one of the trustees is picking out, and so there's a lot of conflict about that. But they don't want to trust a bank or other outside professional. So it's understanding how to find the right criteria for the trustee and understanding the responsibility of the trustee to the family is really important as part of the role of beneficiary.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's not to say that family members are not qualified to do it. It's just that family members happen to have a hard time listening to other family members. Same thing. I have a trust and estates background. I promise you I didn't do my family's trusts and estates. Right. And same thing with family advisors. We don't usually, what's the phrase? You're not a prophet in your own country, something like that.
Profit in his own land.
There we go. Now, if you're already doing it, we have lots of tools and techniques for you, and it is challenging. If we can skip ahead a little bit, and we'll stay here actually. So one of the things we want to talk about isn't to change the trust structure. The trust structure exists, and this is where we'll talk about trust for a little bit. There are kind of three players. There's the grantor. That's the person who's given the money away. And when something's in a trust, it means it doesn't belong to you anymore. This is the hardest thing that many of my founder entrepreneurs struggle with. They didn't know that they gave it away when it was a trust. Their accountant just overemphasized that there was tax savings. So it's not yours anymore. You don't get to decide what happens to it. There's a trustee who is the guy or gal who decides what happens to benefit you. That's where the beneficiary is. And in most states, not all, because the United States has different laws, but in most states, the grantor, the guy or gal who gave it away, cannot be this last part, the beneficiary. That's the person who receives benefit from it. Some states you can, but a lot of them, it cancels out the taxes. So there's the grantor, I gave it, the trustee, the person who's not the grantor, who says what happens to it. Again, in some states it can be the grantor, but in many states it can't. And so a lot of people say it's my spouse for now until I die, and then maybe it'll be one of my kids. And the last is the beneficiary, the person who gets the benefit from it. And again, usually they're not all the same players, because in most states, if they are all the same person, the government says you actually haven't given it away. Therefore, you don't get all the great tax savings related to this. This is very hard for a lot of my clients. A lot of my clients have put their business in a trust already, which makes sense. And then he or she's still trying to run the business as though they're the 100% owner. They may be the CEO, but they are no longer the owner. So because we're ending in a few minutes, the only thing I want to say about this is if you have a trust, you may be a beneficial owner, which means economic benefit. But at the end of the day, it's no longer yours. And so a lot of these fights in families are, I'm the owner. And the truth is, in most cases, you are not. You are the steward, which is great. We've all wanted people to be the steward. That's what we try to get people to understand is it's stewardship. It's bigger than us. And so technically this lens of a trust, this change in relationship can help us have that broad lens that it's really meant to benefit over generations. That's why a trust exists. It gets you the maximum tax advantage for the longest period of time, which again varies state by state. Some are 99 years, some are 99 years, some are even longer than that. And trusts done wrong actually are how trust started. Actually, I have two traditions that still exist from the Crusades. The Crusades were a long time ago. That's when life was short, brutal, and horrific. Right? So hopefully one of a lot of things. But one is the modern day engagement ring, and they used to be sapphire, because blue meant fidelity. And you'd go on the Crusades, you'd be gone for 6 months, 9 months, sometimes several years fighting in the Crusades. And you wanted your wife to be faithful, and you'd come home and hopefully that stone was blue when you came home. Unfortunately, there are color changing sapphires, so I don't want to think about what happened with those sapphires. But at the same time, we also said, because women aren't smart, right? We're not going to let those women who we're hoping are faithful deal with the money. So we're going to give our best trusted steward the role to help take care of her. That's when trust started. So both, and we've reclaimed that, right? Women can't wait to get their beautiful diamond now and obsess about it. We've taken back what engagement rings mean, and we've hopefully taken back what trusts mean. But if we actually don't engage and create a trust that is a relationship that changes the dynamic of trustee knows everything to trustee and beneficiary working together to learn as we go along the way and get feedback from each other along the way, we're ensuring that our heirs will not be prepared, will not make good decisions relative to what happens. There's a great book. It's called Family Trusts. James Hughes is one of the 4 authors. It's in plain English. It's a little thicker, but it has a whole chapter on what informed trustees look like and also what informed beneficiaries look like. And believe it or not, in most cases where trusts go wrong, it isn't an unequipped trustee. It's an uneducated, unequipped beneficiary. So we just have a few more minutes. Leslie, thoughts, questions from anyone who's on the webinar? Because this
Yeah, 2 thoughts that I want to be sure we include, and one is that it isn't just the elder patriarch who needs to do the estate planning. It's also the matriarch, and who can be the business founder as well. But even if she isn't, if she's a beneficiary but will at some point die, she needs to be sure she has her estate plan in order. And also our offspring. Many times offspring don't think that they need to do it. And they may be, for example, kids who are shareholders and they're 21 years old need to have an estate plan, need to have at minimum, a document that shows who their assets would go to, because if they're shares in the business, they need to be able to say, here's who I would choose for them to go to. And a lot of times, and sadly, there's an accident or an early death, and that hasn't been accomplished.
Yes, if there's a choice of where the shares go. I mean, some of
Right.
these government
Right.
documents say where it goes, and that's something we need to know too, right? We
Sure.
need to have, and I encourage all my clients to do this. I've supported my clients in doing this, a plain English translation of all those documents, right? Because you might promise your in-law, your married in spouse who you love, that the business will take care of them forever, and that may not be the truth. And so, yes, absolutely, everyone at every age needs an estate plan. And 2, that knowledge of that estate plan helps each individual family unit do their planning. What parts of it that can be changed, because some parts of it cannot. When you have these irrevocable trusts, there may be no change allowed, but we should still know the world. That's what we call it, the trustscape, right? We should know the trustscape and the estate landscape that we're operating in. It's part of the system, and good or bad, it exists.
And I think one of the fears that we mentioned earlier that people don't do estate plans is because they feel like they can't make changes. But you can have plans that are changeable. You can have revocable trusts so that at least things right now are in trust in a way that you know where it will go. And then at some point you may change it to irrevocable so it's out of your estate and not taxable. But all of these things you can have a degree of flexibility as well.
Many irrevocable trusts have loopholes.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I think is really important is in terms of the transitioning time that you can do trusts that are charitable remainder trusts, that enable you to say during my lifetime, I'm going to benefit, or one of my family members during their lifetime will benefit from this trust. And then when they die, it goes on to a charity. That's a really helpful strategy as well. That's an example of being able to have multiple purposes accomplished at the same time. And so there are many tools like that that are helpful that as families know about, they know that they can accomplish more of their goals and do the planning.
Absolutely. The philanthropy, whether it's a charitable lead, a charitable remainder trust, a donor advised fund, a foundation, a lot of when we start having philanthropic conversations has to do with this tax challenge. And as we know, one of the fastest, most effective ways to engage the next generation, especially when we're talking about grandkids, when we're talking about children, not adult children, is around some philanthropic entity. Great, go do it on your own. And it's a wonderful way to do it in coordination with your accountants and estate planners. And so this doesn't have to be about our death. I mean, when we think about estate, we're thinking about legacy, right? We're thinking about to honor all those things we care about. And that's where this conversation with the next and succeeding generations is wonderful, even though we feel like it might be scary to them, it's uncomfortable, is we're enacting what our name stands for going forward through all of these mechanisms.
And, I think about the legacy piece. And my father started a tradition of having his sister and her family come together over the holidays, and they were all over the world. And we made a commitment as the next generation to continue that. And there's no particular financial connection to it, but it was a tradition that was important to them. And we have all committed to financially support that for our kids to have that experience with their cousins and to keep that family tradition alive. Having that awareness of what's important and sharing that across generations allows those traditions to continue as well. I wonder if we have any questions that we should answer from the participants.
How long will this information be available? So we're going to record this, Esther. It'll get sent out. And it should live on our website. It'll take a little while to populate on the website, but this is evergreen. And you will also get separately, not just the recording, but all the reference slides. You probably noticed we didn't read off the slides. And we will be doing a part 2 on more trust dynamics and executor dynamics in Q1 of next year.
Any questions? If not, thank you all for participating.
Well, I think this was wonderful. I mean, 2 big messages were have those conversations and with your family members and also with yourself, so you understand what values and goals you have that you want to perpetuate in the next generation and beyond. Thank you very much to Natalie and Leslie, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And yes, we'll have the recording will go out and also the slides, and we will have them as a place on our website. We're just creating that next phase of our website. We're still building here at Aspen Family Business Group. We appreciate everyone joining us. And on October 16th, we have our next drop-in Coffee with Leslie, and that's a chance for dialogue. It's a meeting format versus a webinar format. So we have robust conversation with everybody who joins us, and it's a great opportunity to learn from each other, learn from Leslie, and Casey's putting it there in the chat as well. So we appreciate having everyone with us today.
And Shelley, I also want to mention that the Aspen Family Business Group becoming a nonprofit is part of our legacy, a legacy of David Bork, who was one of our founders who sadly passed away not too long ago, and right before him, Joe Paul. And so all of that intellectual capital is now going to be available globally through our SAM, our bot who's accessing all of our knowledge. And all of that's possible because several of you and many of you out there have contributed to our building this knowledge base and building this program to make it available to people no matter where they are, no matter what their financial background. So I also want to just say thank you for helping us accomplish our dreams.
Absolutely. Much appreciated. Thank you all, and we will see you next time. Casey put our link to the website in there as well. Thank you, Casey, and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you're joining us from. Thank you.